It wasn't just a liberation. It was a descent into a geography of the damned. On April 15, 1945, the British 11th Armored Division rolled into the gates of Bergen-Belsen, expecting the crisp, professional resistance of a retreating German army. Instead, they found a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. It wasn't a battlefield. It was a billion-dollar tomb of the spirit. How did a regime that prided itself on clockwork precision and industrial might allow a patch of German soil to devolve into a landscape where 13,000 unburied corpses lay like discarded lumber? Why did the machinery of the Reich, so obsessed with order, choose to vanish, leaving only the smell of decay and the hollow stares of 60,000 walking skeletons? But that was only the surface. The true horror wasn't the absence of the masters. It was the presence of those who stayed behind. Standing among the mountains of the dead were women. Young, blonde, and impeccably dressed, they walked through the filth as if strolling through a city park. At their center stood Irma Grese, a girl the British officers first mistook for a refugee until they saw the whip in her hand and the cold, diamond-hard vacuum in her eyes. Why did the most powerful empire in Europe trust its darkest secrets to a girl from a dairy farm? The answer wasn't in the classified vaults, but in the dust of time. The sun over Lower Saxony that April is a cruel irony. It shines with a spring warmth that the inhabitants of Bergen-Belsen can no longer feel. To understand Belsen, one must understand that it was never designed to be a factory of death like Auschwitz. There were no gas chambers here, no industrial chimneys belching the remains of the innocent into the atmosphere. Instead, Belsen was a black box of systematic negligence. The mechanism was simple, and the physics were brutal. When the High Command realized the war was lost, they simply stopped. They cut the water lines. They diverted the food trucks. In a confined space with 60,000 people, the human body becomes its own executioner. Without water, the blood thickens into a sludge that the heart can no longer push through the veins. Within 72 hours, the kidneys fail, the brain begins to misfire, and the person is replaced by a biological shell. This was the fatal flaw designed by the system, a massacre through inertia. It was cheaper than bullets. It was more efficient than gas. It was a massacre of the soul through the withdrawal of the basic elements of life. But while the generals fled, the whips of the Reich remained. Irma Grese is only 21 years old. In another life, she was a provincial girl who dreamed of being a nurse, a hairdresser, perhaps a film star. She is the embodiment of the human paradox, the ordinary citizen who finds that her only talent is the calibration of pain. While the camp around her dissolved into a medieval nightmare of typhus and cannibalism, Greece's quarters remained a sanctuary of perfume and ironed linens. She is the product of a system that rewarded the most base instincts of the human heart, elevating a girl from the periphery of society into a god of the barracks. She is the ghost in the machine. While the British tanks were still miles away, grinding through the German mud, Grese was not preparing a defense. She was polishing her heavy, reinforced boots. She was ensuring her whip braided from the finest leather was supple. She was maintaining the illusion of power while the world she served was incinerating itself. The British officers, led by Colonel Derek Sington, enter the camp and find the SS guards waiting for them. There is no shame in their posture. There is only a terrifying, crystallized arrogance. They stand in formation, their uniforms pressed, their hair styled, looking for all the world like they are awaiting a change of the guard rather than the end of a genocide. Cincton approaches a group of these women. He expects them to cower, to plead, to point toward the officers who gave them orders. Instead, he is met with a representative quote of the era's hubris. One of the female guards, Elizabeth Volkenrath, looks at the starving women around her women who have been reduced to translucent shadows and shrugs. "We were simply maintaining order," she says, her voice as flat as the plains surrounding the camp. "The manual dictated the rations. If they died, it was because they were no longer efficient for the state." She treats the catastrophe as a ledger error, not a moral collapse. To her, the dying were not humans. They were stalled components in a failing machine. The British soldiers, men who had fought through the beaches of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, find themselves breaking. They have seen death in the trenches. They have seen the violence of artillery, but they have never seen this. They see the beautiful beast, as the press will later call Grese, standing in her tailored uniform, and the contrast creates a visceral sickness. The system had failed. The Reich was a smoking ruin, but the individual agent of that system, the underdog who had risen to power through cruelty, was still clinging to her authority. But the hammer of reality is about to strike. The British do not execute them on the spot. They do something far more calculated. They force the guards, these women who had spent years avoiding the touch of the unclean, to pick up the bodies. They force the polished boots into the mass graves. They strip away the distance between the bureaucrat and the victim. Grese remains defiant. She believes the British will respect her rank, her gender, her beauty. She treats the liberation as a temporary inconvenience, a strategic error that will soon be rectified by the rules of war. She underestimated her new masters. The British didn't want her respect. They wanted her to see what she had built. As she drags the cold, light-as-paper remains of a prisoner toward a pit, the silence of the camp begins to change. It is no longer the silence of the dying. It is the silence of the witness. For the first time, the survivors see their tormentors humiliated, their hands stained with the very filth they used as a weapon. The British military police move in, and the documentation begins. They find the whips. They find the photos of Grese posing in the camp as if it were a vacation resort. They find the evidence of a specific, intimate sadism that the official reports couldn't capture. The world was about to learn that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones hiding in the shadows, but the ones who smile for the camera. The trial is coming, and the ghosts of Belsen are preparing to speak. To September 17th, 1945, Lüneburg, Germany. The courtroom is a stark, wooden chamber smelling of floor wax and the damp wool of military uniforms. Outside, the world is attempting to rebuild from the rubble. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of a different kind of decay, the moral rot of the system being dragged into the light. This is the first great trial of the Holocaust. Before the world would turn its eyes to the high-ranking architects at Nuremberg, it first had to look into the eyes of the rank and file. The whips of the Reich are no longer standing over pits. They are seated in a dock, numbered like evidence in a museum of the grotesque. At the center is Irma Grese, wearing number 9. She sits with her back straight, her hair perfectly coiffed, occasionally sharing a whispered joke with Elisabeth Volkenrath. They believe they are safe. They believe the fatal flaw of the legal system, its insistence on evidence and procedure, will be their shield. They are the personification of the establishment's lingering arrogance. The Defense Counsel, a British major named Cranfield, begins to build a wall of paper. He argues that these women were cogs in a machine. He suggests they were victims of a brutal environment, girls who were swept up by the tides of history and forced to follow orders. He portrays them as naive, perhaps a bit stern, but ultimately harmless. They were girls from the countryside, the defense suggests. How could they be responsible for a collapse of such magnitude? But history is about to be corrected by those the system tried to erase. The prosecution calls Helen Copper to the stand. She is emaciated, her voice a fragile thread that threatens to snap at any moment. She is the underdog, the invisible agent of truth. When she looks at Grese, the courtroom goes silent. The "yes, but" of the defense begins to crumble. Yes, the system was brutal, but Grese chose the weight of her boots. Copper describes the human solution, the way Grese didn't just follow orders, but innovated within them. She tells the court about the dogs. Grese didn't just use them for guard duty. She trained them to target the most vulnerable parts of the human anatomy. She describes the whip, not as a tool of discipline, but as an instrument of art. Copper's testimony reveals the blind spot in the defense's logic. The system provided the opportunity, but the individual provided the soul-crushing malice. The courtroom watches as the beautiful beast loses her composure. It isn't a scream or a cry. It is a subtle shift. The smirk vanishes. The ghost in the machine is being forced into the light. But as the testimony reaches its peak, a new danger emerges, a technical failure of the law itself. How do you prove a murder when there are no bodies left to autopsy? How do you convict a person of systematic cruelty when the system they served has been burned to the ground? The judges are faced with a mechanical failure of justice. The law is designed for single crimes, for specific moments of violence. It is not built to measure the weight of 60,000 souls lost to calculated abandonment. The defense scoffs at the survivors' memories, treating their trauma as a technical glitch in their testimony. They dismiss the stories of reinforced boots and trained beasts as melodramatic exaggerations of the starving. The defense believes their logic is impenetrable. They treat the survivors' pain as an emotional outburst that has no place in a forensic setting. They believe the Pechem protocol of the court will protect the perpetrators because the scale of the horror is simply too large for a jury to comprehend. But they have fatally underestimated the power of the specific. It wasn't the thousands of deaths that broke the defense. It was the one death they couldn't explain away. A survivor stands and describes a moment when Grese shot a girl for the crime of being too slow to die. It wasn't an order from Berlin. It wasn't a policy of the Reich. It was a choice. In that moment, the crystallized arrogance of the guards begins to fracture. The mask of just following orders slips, revealing the face of a woman who enjoyed the power of life and death. The bitter aftertaste of the trial begins to set in. Even if they are convicted, how can any sentence possibly balance the scales? While the court debates the legalities of genocide, the world outside is learning a terrifying lesson. The experts saw complexity. They saw hierarchies, chains of command, and bureaucratic structures. But the survivors saw simplicity. They saw that evil doesn't always need a grand plan. Sometimes it only needs a girl with a whip and a system that tells her she is special. The prosecution pushes forward, layering detail upon detail until the sheer weight of the evidence becomes an anchor. They present the black box of Belsen the logs, the ration cards that were never filled, the medical reports that noted death by exhaustion as if it were a natural cause. They show that while the prisoners were eating grass and shoe leather, the guards were feasting on the Red Cross parcels meant for the dying. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a logistics failure. It was a choice to let others perish so that the system could remain comfortable. As Part 2 draws to a close, the tribunal retires to deliberate. The guards are led back to their cells. Grese is no longer whispering. She is looking at her hands that are no longer holding a whip, but are now empty, shaking slightly in the cold air of the German autumn. She believed she was the mistress of the camp. She believed she was too useful, too young, or too beautiful to be destroyed. But the hammer of justice is descending, and it doesn't care about the grooming of the defendant. It only cares about the truth that lies in the dust of Belsen. The verdict is coming, and with it, a reckoning that will haunt the 20th century. December 13th, 1945. Hamelin Prison, Lower Saxony. The winter air is a sharp, clinical cold that bites at the skin. Inside the thick stone walls of the prison, there is a rhythm that the inmates recognize, the heavy, rhythmic thud of a carpenter's hammer. It is the sound of a system finalizing its verdict. The British have not built a monument to justice. They have built a gallows. At the center of this final act is a man of quiet, terrifying professionalism, Albert Pierre Point. He is the British Empire's most prolific executioner, a man who treats the long drop not as a vengeance, but as a calculation. For Pierre Point, death is a matter of physics. He considers the weight of the condemned, the length of the rope, and the gravity required to ensure the neck snaps instantly. If the rope is too long, the head is torn away. Too short, and the victim strangles in a slow, agonizing dance. Pierre Point is the hammer that the arrogance of the Reich never saw coming. In the early morning light, the first of the condemned are led to the small, cold room. Among them are Elisabeth Volkenrath and Juana Bormann. They walk with the heavy, sluggish gait of those who have finally realized that their protocol of power has expired. But Irma Grese is different. Even now, at the threshold of the void, she clings to the ghost in the machine. She has spent her final days in a cell singing Nazi anthems, her voice echoing through the corridors like a defiant relic of a dead world. She is 22 years old, the youngest woman to be executed under British law in centuries. When the door to her cell opens, she does not tremble. She does not ask for mercy, a concept she had long ago edited out of her own vocabulary. She walks toward the gallows with a terrifying plastic calm. She is still the beautiful beast, her hair brushed, her face a mask of stone. She climbs the steps of the scaffold as if she is ascending a stage. Pierrepoint approaches her to place the white hood over her head. For a moment, their eyes meet. In that split second, the crystallized arrogance of the Reich flares one last time. Grese does not offer a prayer or a plea. Instead, she barks a single, sharp command in German. Schnell, quickly. It is her final act of agency, an attempt to command her own executioner, to maintain the illusion that she is the one in control of the timing. But the system of the law is indifferent to her commands. Pierrepoint pulls the lever. The trap door falls with a sound like a gunshot. And then there is only the swaying of the rope in the sudden, hollow silence. The bitter victory of Hamelin is that the death of 3 women cannot possibly pay the debt of Belsen. As the bodies are taken down, they are buried in the prison yard in unmarked graves. Later, when the prison is decommissioned, their remains are moved to a secret location, their names scrubbed from the earth to prevent their graves from becoming shrines for those who still harbor the seed of the Reich. This is the cruel irony of history. We want a climax that feels like a resolution, a fire that purifies the world. But Belsen was not purified. The land where the camp stood remains a scarred, quiet clearing. The 13,000 unburied corpses found by the liberators were eventually placed into mass mounds where the grass grows thick and green, fed by the remains of the invisible agents of change who never got to see the spring of 1945. We look back at Irma Grese and see a monster, a deviation from the human norm. But the forensic historian must ask a darker question. Was she a monster, or was she simply a mirror? Grese was an ordinary girl who was given a uniform and a license to be her worst self. She was an underdog who found that the system would reward her for her cruelty, as long as that cruelty was directed at the right people. She didn't invent the hatred, she just optimized it. Do we see this same hubris in our society today? We live in a world of massive systems, of algorithms, bureaucracies, and digital black boxes that distance us from the consequences of our choices. We tell ourselves that we are just following the data, just adhering to the protocol, just maintaining order. We believe that our modern structures are too advanced, too civilized to allow for another Belsen. But the technical failure of the human heart is not a glitch of the past. It is a persistent feature. The friction between the human spirit and the system is constant. When the system prioritizes efficiency over empathy, when it treats people as components rather than souls, it creates a vacancy. And into that vacancy, people like Irma Grese will always step. The bitter aftertaste of this story is the realization that justice, while necessary, is a reactive force. It arrives after the silence has already set in. The true mission is not just to punish the whips of the Reich, but to recognize the moment the whip is first braided. It is to hear the warning from the girls the generals laugh at before the water lines are cut and the food trucks are diverted. History does not repeat, but it does echo. And if you listen closely to the wind over the mounds of Belsen, you can still hear the snap of the trap door, a reminder that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones in the history books. They are the ones currently waiting for a system that will finally give them permission to be themselves. If you believe that stories like Helen Copper's and the forgotten victims of Belsen deserve to be remembered, join our ranks by subscribing, like, We have synthesized this narrative from reputable historical archives and verified sources. However, the fog of war often extends to the history books. If you spot any inaccuracies or have additional details to share, please correct us in the comments. We strive for the absolute truth, and your knowledge helps us get there. Thank you for keeping history alive.